In today's geopolitical environment, world leaders agree on very little, but reining in big tech's monopolistic behavior is one idea that many people can probably get behind. With economic prosperity, political stability, and the individual freedom of everyone using the internet at stake, how should the digital economy be regulated? I'm Yun-Hee Kim, personal technology editor at The Washington Post, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Anu Bradford, who's a professor at Columbia Law School and a senior scholar at the Chazen Institute. She's also the author of The Brussels Effect, How the EU Rules the World, which Foreign Affairs has called the single most important book on Europe's influence to appear in a decade. Today, we'll get a preview of what she's working on right now, her forthcoming book, Battle for the Soul of the Digital Economy. Welcome, Anu.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Let's start with the state of big tech right now. There's new regulation coming out from Europe, potentially later this year, that seeks to curb some of the power that big tech giants have today. In terms of regulation, where are we now and where are we headed?
So it is indeed a big year in Brussels. There are many ambitious legislative proposals in works, and I expect all those to be passing. So we're really taking a hard look at how to transform the digital economy, and the EU is taking the lead. So we have regulations on market competition, on digital services, so online content, on artificial intelligence, on platform workers. So there is certainly a momentum behind this legislation that is reflecting a very critical look that both European consumers of technology, so the digital citizens, and then the politicians across the political spectrum are taking on in asserting then the power of the government to rein in these big tech companies.
It's called the Digital Markets Act, and it's actually not surprising that Europe is actually taking the lead in regulating the big tech giants potentially in the US. How do you think this act will impact potential regulation that's on the way in the US?
Yes, so Yun-Hee, the Digital Markets Act is now the one that went through the legislative process the fastest, and it has already been provisionally agreed upon. And what is striking about this regulation is that it is an ex-ante set of prohibitions and obligations on these tech companies. So the EU has been trying to unlock competition in the marketplace for the past decade. So there has been several competition cases, 3 fines amounting to about 10 billion against Google alone. But these cases take a long time to build. You need a lot of evidence, and they are very, very slow. So there has been a recognition that this is just not enough. We need a new set of tools. And the Digital Markets Act gives this new set of tools by really giving the European Commission, the main enforcer, the power to ex ante, to say that once you meet a certain threshold, you are considered to be a digital gatekeeper, and then you are not allowed to engage in these practices. So this can really be transformative, and I think it can indeed influence the United States as well, because there are many bills pending before the Congress right now that contain elements of the Digital Markets Act. So this is really a message to the Americans that even though it is hard, it can be done. It will be done, and soon they will say it has been done. And the Americans really have now the choice whether they continue to sit on the sidelines and watch for the Europeans to regulate the US tech companies, or whether they want to get on the game and share that space as the regulators of the industry as well.
Why has tech regulation in the United States been so slow? I mean, what is slowing us down so much compared to the EU that's kind of on to the next big regulation of big tech?
Yeah, so I believe there are a few reasons. So one is that I think any regulation, any legislation has a hard time passing through Congress. So our legislator is extremely divided on many issues. And here, when we talk about Digital Markets Act type of antitrust reforms, we're really asking hard fundamental questions on whether we still trust the markets. And ultimately, the Americans have had much more faith in the self-correcting nature of the market and much less faith in the governments improving the outcomes by intervening. And this presumption is not shared in Europe. So Europeans have for a long time been much more skeptical that we can just delegate this to the company's self-regulation. And there's been less of an idea that the government is unable to intervene in productive ways. So partially it's more a cultural, ideological question, but also just the dynamics in today's Congress, which just makes it very difficult to get any legislation through.
Given what you've just pointed out about kind of the different ways of thinking when it comes to regulation, do you think the Digital Markets Act in its current form could be translated into the United States successfully, or what are some of the challenges?
So in many ways, if you think about the philosophy, if you like, behind the Digital Markets Act, so the goal is really to introduce more fairness into the marketplace, to make sure that also smaller entrants can challenge these big tech giants. And that's the kind of philosophy that I think if you ask American digital citizens, the internet users, they are increasingly in agreement that we do need to challenge these big tech giants. We need more competition, we need more regulation, and we need to distribute the power in a more even ways. It is the question of economic power, but also if you think about the political power that these companies have. And I think even in the US, the citizens have become just more skeptical that that is a stable equilibrium for a long time. So in that sense, it would be a shift, but it is a shift that I think most Americans have now acknowledged that some degree of reform is needed.
Mm-hmm. I was reading an article that quoted France's Minister of State for the digital sector, and Cedric Go has said the goal of the act isn't to really break up tech companies, but to break them open. I wonder if you could kind of walk us through what breaking them open might look like. What will big tech end up doing or be forced to do? And what does that mean for consumers?
Yeah, so I like the framing that the Europeans are not here trying to break these companies up. So this whole conversation about breaking the big tech has not dominated the political discourse. And if you think about it, even under the current law, the Europeans would be allowed to do that, but they have not chosen to pursue that path. So, and I don't think even though under the Digital Markets Act, that could be the ultimate remedy, that there's going to be many steps that the Europeans will try before they would turn to that. So what would it mean then to open up, the break these tech companies open, is that, for instance, they would not be able to have their own walled garden. So Apple is not able to require that you need to use just Apple App Store. You need to allow a competing app store into your phone. Or then if you have App Store, you need to allow alternative payment mechanisms that you use when you are operating that app store. So that's just an example of how we want to make sure that there is greater interoperability, for instance. So the idea that you will be able to connect these different device makers. So one of the most radical proposals, at least some people describe it as such, of the Digital Markets Act was that you would need to be able to send a message from Telegram or Signal into WhatsApp. So you need to get these different technologies and different apps speaking to one another. So the idea is really to break those barriers that these companies have been able to create, that have directed the consumers to one particular company and their set of technologies.
I can see that for consumers, this would be a win because you don't have to sign up for one specific service and you can use multiple services. But from the big tech companies' standpoint, I can see some resistance. For example, Apple, which has spent years building their digital walled gardens so that they can keep consumers in their own ecosystem. I would anticipate some backlash. What are your thoughts on that from big tech?
So we certainly have heard how much resistance there has been to some of these provisions. So one argument is that now the regulators are putting themselves in the place of product designers. There's concerns that these companies have raised about what about privacy if we are now sharing much more data, including with our competitors? What about just cybersecurity? So one thing that Apple takes a lot of pride of is that the security benefits of the tough review mechanisms that they can internally impose. So, but one that we often hear, obviously, what happens to innovation? Is this regulation just too burdensome? But I will say it was striking how much these companies tried to turn over and amend the Digital Markets Act, how much lobbying took place, and ultimately how ineffective that lobbying was. So, like I mentioned earlier, the momentum is so heavily behind the regulators in Brussels that these companies' arguments have really been in vain for the most part.
Do you think the EU model will prevail in other markets? What are your thoughts about? Because you do point out that this model will probably win out other models in other countries in your upcoming book.
Yeah, so in the book, I divide the world in the sense that I believe there are three predominant ways to think about the regulation of the digital economy. So we have the American market-driven regulatory model, we have the Chinese state-driven model, and we have the European rights-driven model. So ultimately the question is, will one of them prevail, or will we actually have these like three different spheres of digital economy? And whether we have full technological decoupling and internet, I doubt we see that, but we do see some balances shifting across these models. So first of all, I am predicting that the American market-driven model will lose. There seems to be a near global consensus that we do need intervention, that the markets haven't produced the kind of freedom and stable democracy, or even the kind of economic growth, if you think about the distribution of those benefits, that the societies would be comfortable with. So there's a pushback against the American model. What I predict as in the democratic world, the European rights-driven model is increasingly gaining traction. So if you look at the legislators around the world, they are converging increasingly behind the European way of legislating. But I don't think the Europeans are winning all over the world. The Chinese state-driven model is also doing very well. China is extremely successful in exporting its model by building the digital infrastructures across the world and exporting its norms in the process. It is very successful in selling, for instance, AI-powered surveillance technologies that are in high demand in the world that is turning increasingly authoritarian. So there are these different dynamics that I am exploring in the book, where I do think that Europeans are gaining a lot of the currency in terms of the battle of the values, but they face some difficulties. First of all, ingraining those values into actual market outcomes. It's not easy to regulate these tech companies. And second, the threat of the increasing appeal of the Chinese state-driven model.
And we've seen with this state-controlled regulatory model in China that it doesn't really hinder innovation. We've seen a lot of success with innovation coming out of China. So I wonder if the future of a regulatory model is really kind of a combination of the rights model and the state-driven model. Curious to hear your thoughts.
Yes, so there are many countries that are not strictly within certain sphere of influence. So if you think about jurisdictions like India or Brazil or even Russia, they do take parts of different models. So India, for instance, copies European rights-driven regulation in privacy and other domains in antitrust pretty closely. But then when they are regulating speech online, that content moderation has elements of more of an authoritarian control. The same thing if you think about the Brazilians that have many of the kind of American traditions in thinking about how originally they thought about content moderation and the Communications Decency Act, the Liability Shield, all copied in the Brazilian model, the European rights-driven privacy model, yet the importation of Chinese digital infrastructure and some of those norms also, especially when you have more of a sort of strongman populist governments that are willing to keep more control of the economies. And Russia, that is, I would say, now increasingly turning authoritarian. But there we see an interesting shift whereby they have not been as skilled in having the kind of comprehensive control of the digital society that the Chinese have been able to have up until recently, because they started with a very market-driven model. So it has taken a lot of effort for Russians to be able to contain the full control. Now, there's certainly what we're seeing, what is happening in Ukraine and the propaganda war and the extent to which the government is really reining in the freedom of speech online. So we do see these models being dynamic, whereby societies are shifting. It wasn't until Putin's re-election, for instance, that Russia really started controlling the internet.
And we're seeing a lot of success with the Ukraine government in this war as well, kind of utilizing the open markets to its advantage against Russia.
Absolutely. So it has been as scary and dreadful it has been to watch the war. If you think about also the role of the information war, and also the choices, the difficult choices that these tech companies have in navigating very difficult situation when there are conflicting demands from Russian government, from Ukrainian government, what the EU governments want them to do, what Americans want them to do. And these companies are making real-time decisions that are extremely consequential. And I would say, when often these companies say that the government shouldn't regulate them because governments don't understand technology, I am not sure if these companies fully understand geopolitics and democracy and fundamental rights that are at stake with the decisions that these companies need to be making.
So let's talk about kind of the impact on tech innovation as a result of more regulation. I think critics will argue that the EU model has really not led to much success in kind of big tech giants emanating from that region and more tech innovation. How do you see this kind of panning out?
So, Yun-Hee, I completely understand where that criticism comes from. There is no European Google or European Meta or European Apple or Amazon. And if you look at various statistics, just recently I looked at from 2021, the world's leading technology companies that Forbes listed. If you look at the top 20 of them, there are 2 European companies on that list. And you can contrast that to there being 13 American companies on that list. So it's very tempting to draw this conclusion that the Europeans must just be over-regulating these companies so we don't see innovation. But I actually think that the story is much more nuanced and complicated. So it is not necessarily that the regulation is holding the Europeans back. So at the time Google was created, Facebook was created, there was hardly any digital regulation in Europe. Yet those companies emanated from the Silicon Valley. So I think there are many other issues that Europe needs to get right in order to get into the game and not just be the regulator and the referee, but to actually be the player. And one of those is, for instance, if you think about it, really needs to integrate the digital single market. So European small tech startups are not benefiting from an integrated digital single market. They are also not able to raise funding because we do not have, again, an integrated, robust, deep capital markets union in the EU. So often they get acquired by American companies, so they can raise early rounds of funding, but after that, the funding dries up and they turn to American venture capital. So those are some of the examples. Another one I would raise is that absolutely much more punitive bankruptcy laws. So insolvency is very costly in the EU, and we know how hard it is to come up with disruptive innovations, and sometimes you fail. But in the US, it's almost like a rite of passage. It's just part of being an entrepreneur. That's not the end of your life. Whereas in Europe, it is a personal tragedy. And often it just leaves you not being able to raise funds again. So those are some of the issues. And I also would raise just American companies' ability to draw on the best talent from around the world. And partially through its world-class universities that become a theater for the labor market in the United States. And the Europeans just have not been able to replicate that benefit of the diversity and access to the world's best talent.
So a lot of it, I guess, depends on some of these external factors that the US offers versus the EU. I'm wondering, though, the big tech companies will argue for sure that more regulation will stifle innovation. What is your thought on that? Do you think that at the level that we're looking at in terms of like the upcoming regulation in the US, it will hinder more innovation here in the US?
Yeah, so I would look at, we talked a lot about antitrust, but if you look at, for instance, the lack of antitrust enforcement in the US, what kind of market outcomes do we have? We actually have much less competition in US, much more concentrated markets, much higher profits for companies and higher prices for consumers. So if I compare my flight from Brussels to Madrid cost a fraction of what my flight from New York to Chicago cost. My cell phone plans are much cheaper in Europe than they are in the US to great extent because there's more competition in the European market. Why is there more competition? There is more regulation. So in many ways, we see a lot of examples where regulation, if you think about AI, for instance, the European argument is that all the consumers do not trust artificial intelligence unless it is regulated. So it can actually lead to greater uptake of those technologies if the consumers trust that the algorithms that are powering those AI applications are bias-free and are actually resulting to better outcomes. And that there is ultimately a human in the loop, that there is still the way that we can, for instance, have a better understanding of how those decisions are being made. So I at the same time, I want to be clear, it's not that all regulation is good. There certainly is the point after which regulation can be detrimental to innovation. I'm rather trying to open the conversation through my book is that we cannot have this immediate reaction that if the European model prevails, for instance, in the US, that would be the end of innovation in the US. That's not going to kill the US capital markets. That's not going to stop the talent coming to the United States. That's not going to rewrite our bankruptcy codes. That's not going to unravel the more integrated market structure that we have. So I think we need to just sort of attribute some of the European failures to where those failures actually stem from, instead of saying that always it's just regulation.
Right, and I guess it also depends on to what degree do you regulate so that you don't stifle innovation. I'm wondering here in Silicon Valley, there have been some big startups that have kind of, have risen and then have fallen also equally quite quickly, thinking about companies like WeWork or Theranos, the blood testing startup founded by Elizabeth Holmes. And there seems to be this kind of mentality of fake it till you make it, and that is what kind of drives the innovation here in Silicon Valley. Do you believe that kind of mentality is not tolerated in other regions, and that's why we're not seeing a lot more innovation?
No, I think it's interesting. And the examples you mentioned, I think, are some that the Europeans could point to, that we do need to have more regulation. We need to have more ethics, and this kind of more risk-seeking behavior can sometimes really be detrimental. But at the same time, I think there are, when those American innovations and that culture succeeds, it can succeed in a spectacular way. But then when it fails, it can also fail in a more spectacular way. And you just need to think about what is your attitude, what is your approach towards risk-taking? And I think Europeans are more risk-averse. So in many ways, we probably don't have as big sort of falling from the top the way we have in the WeWork or Theranos cases, for instance. But it is also harder to be truly successful unless you have that kind of, you would say, almost reckless mentality at some point, that you really engage in the kind of risk-taking, knowing that the chances of succeeding are not as guaranteed. So there's a lot that I think Europeans can learn from Americans when it comes to the entrepreneurial spirit, the culture of not being as fear of failing. And at the same time, I think the Americans can learn a lot from Europeans, because sometimes having a little bit more regulatory constraints around that culture can introduce a sort of healthy dose of discipline into the market and the way we think about developing and deploying these technologies. So I think we have many examples showing that ultimately this techno-optimist, techno-libertarian culture has not produced so much freedom and democracy. In fact, I think we can really think that we can attribute a lot of the crisis of the democracy. You just look at what happened in January 6th with the Capitol insurrection and think about the role of the social media companies in events like that. It can be extremely destabilizing for the society if this is the kind of free for all and we do not have regulators play a role. So ultimately, the regulators need to respect and understand the importance of these companies for technological economic progress and innovation. But these companies also need to understand that ultimately there are many important societal considerations that we need the democratically elected governments in the picture to steer also the societies that are impacted by these technologies.
What about techno-nationalism? We seem to be heading in the direction where each country wants to kind of be a leader in every sector of technology, and we're certainly seeing that with the U.S. and China and the race for dominance of artificial intelligence. The U.S. is doubling down on its semiconductor kind of infrastructure and manufacturing here in the U.S. because for too long, it was reliant on the Taiwanese companies for manufacturing. Do you think that we are headed in that direction, and is that good or bad?
So, Yun-Hee, I'm afraid that we are heading to that direction. That gives me a great deal of pause. And I understand where those impulses come from. The world is extremely volatile, and we can see how those interdependencies can be weaponized in geopolitical ways. And I think no country should be too dependent on any given other country or region for certain critical technological needs. So semiconductors, for instance. So I understand where the notion of digital sovereignty or technological sovereignty, it comes from genuine vulnerabilities and a recognition that really is not prudent to be so reliant on certain sources of supply. But at the same time, it's really now pushing all the governments towards the kind of techno-nationalism that you were describing. So we have these subsidy races about batteries or AI, about cloud computing. And I don't think that is really the path towards a more efficient and healthy digital economy and society. So how are the Europeans responding to the tech race between the US and China? They are pursuing greater strategic autonomy. They are also worried about their digital sovereignty. And we do see more inward-looking policymaking. So ultimately, I believe that, for instance, why has America been so successful? It has been because of its commitment to open markets, to its commitment to innovation. And the same for Europeans. I don't think that techno-protectionism is going to be the path to get more European companies onto that list of top 100 leading tech companies. So ultimately, it's going to be detrimental, but to some extent, it is almost inevitable when you have the situation where each government is responding to what they see that the other governments are doing. So the Europeans are, and this is something that I have warned about, that the European model winning is partially because people have thought that those values of fairness, democracy, of open marketplace have served Europe well, and they would serve the rest of the world well. And reversing from that and starting to export techno-protectionism, for instance, would certainly not even serve the interest of the Europeans. So I do hope that ultimately the countries and regions don't forget their comparative advantage. And for the West, for the democratic countries, it has been a commitment to the kind of openness. So we would attend to those vulnerabilities with prudence and care, and just an extreme thoughtfulness of the consequences of techno-protectionism.
That's actually really good advice and very insightful. Thank you so much, Yun-Hee, for joining us today. Look very much forward to seeing your book out very soon.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.